Hey friends, monopolies are single sellers. They are usually firms that represent the entire market or occupy a significant share of the market, also known as market share. They can own the market because they produce a unique good or service with no close substitute. And this means that they can also set their own prices for these unique goods and services, and we know them as what we call price setters or price makers. Monopolies can do these because there are high barriers to entry in order to enter the market. It is very difficult for new firms or competitors to compete with them. And as we see in this mind map, there are 5 key barriers to entry in the IB Economics syllabus. The first one would be economies of scale, which lowers the average cost for the monopoly. And this makes it very difficult for new entrants or competitors to compete with the monopoly in terms of cost. The second barrier to entry would be branding, when the firm becomes so well known by consumers that they become preferred by consumers. Apple is a very well-known example of having strong branding, which acts as a barrier to entry. The third barrier to entry would be legal barriers, which include tools such as patents or licenses to protect the monopoly's products so that competitors can't copy or steal them. The fourth barrier to entry would be control of essential resources, which basically refers to controlling the supply chain or inputs of production, just like how De Beers did with mining of diamonds in South Africa. Without these inputs, other competitors cannot produce competing goods and services. The fifth barrier to entry would be what we call aggressive tactics, which basically include tactics such as price cuts, hostile takeovers, or aggressive advertising. And these tactics dissuade new firms from entering the market. So Google is an example of a monopoly, especially in the search engine market. And it's so popular to the point whereby it has become a verb in itself to search for something. So what does this mean in terms of Google's prices, revenues, and profits? Well, this diagram that you see over here shows the monopoly's demand and revenue curve. The revenue curve is the first diagram above, and the demand curve is the second diagram below on this screen. So let me just explain the demand curve first, which is the second diagram that you see over here. So we see that the demand curve slopes downwards, unlike the straight line that we see for perfectly competitive firms. So one question that you may have is, why do we have this downward sloping shape? Because monopolies can set their own price to maximize revenues, and they will lower prices to maximize their output sold. So one question would be, well, why not just set prices as high as possible in order to maximize revenue? Well, keep that question in mind. We'll be coming back to this after looking at the revenue diagram. So looking at the revenue curve, we notice that total revenues increase from 0 and reach a maximum when the quantity sold is about 7, right? After hitting 7, as the firm produces and sells more, the total revenue actually goes down. So why does this total revenue curve seem to increase and dip after a point? And why don't the firms simply maximize prices, since they are price setters anyway? Well, these have to do with the goods elasticity of demand. While monopolies indeed can set their own prices, they cannot influence the elasticity of demand for their goods. So they can only set prices to maximize revenues based on the elasticity of demand. The monopoly knows that as they sell more output from 0 to 7, as we see over here, lowering the prices will sell more output until the point Q equals to 7, and this will increase total revenue. And this explains why the monopoly is willing to lower prices and produce up to this point, which also maximizes revenue for them. And this explains why the demand curve is sloping downwards to sell more items. And if you recall from an earlier video, the firm maximizes the revenue at the point whereby your marginal revenue is 0. And this explains why the marginal revenue curve intersects the x-axis. So now that we know firms such as Google can influence prices to maximize revenue, how does this affect their profits? Well, there are 3 key steps to determine total profits for a monopolist. The first step would be to find the profit maximizing level of output using the marginal revenue and marginal cost approach, because we know that monopolies would want to produce at the profit maximizing level of output. The second step would be to find the profit per unit by using the formula profit per unit equals to P minus AC. And the last one is just to multiply the profit per unit by the total number of units sold. So applying this to the diagram that you see on this screen, let's look at the leftmost graph. which is the abnormal profits graph. Applying this, we first find the intersection whereby your marginal revenue is equals to your marginal cost. The marginal revenue and marginal cost curves intersect each other at the red circle. And note that we need to extrapolate the dotted line up to the price level, because this is the actual price that the good is selling at. So we know that Q1 over here is the profit maximizing level of output, and that is step 1. So step 2, at this Q1, this is the gap between the actual price per unit sold and the average cost to produce the unit sold, because this point that I just circled is the average cost curve over here. So to find the total profit, we just need to multiply this gap, represented by red arrows, by the total number of quantities sold, which is Q1, and this gives you the total abnormal profit, which is the yellow highlighted box that you see. And as we have identified in the earlier perfectly competitive firms video, the middle graph shows the monopoly experiencing normal profit, where the price at the profit maximizing level covers the average cost only. And the rightmost graph shows the loss, right? Where the average cost at the profit maximizing level of output is higher than the goods price. One different thing to take note of is that unlike perfect competition, there are no short-run or long-run profits in the context of a monopoly, because monopolies are price setters. They can enjoy abnormal profits in the long run. And because the barriers to entry for monopolies are usually quite high, so they can continue to reap abnormal profits in the long run. So what are some of the implications and market outcomes for continuously abnormal profits? The first thing to take note is that the monopoly will sell a lower output at a higher price than market equilibrium because they want to maximize profits. So applying this to the graph, we see that the actual output produced by the market, which is reflected in this graph as QM, is lower than the market equilibrium level of output, which is reflected at QPC. And in terms of the price, PM, which reflects the actual price that the monopoly sells at, and it is higher than the actual equilibrium price at PE. This informs us that there is some degree of market failure, and there are some differences between the consumer and producer surplus. Area C, which is reflected as the blue triangle, is the consumer surplus, area D is the producer surplus, and areas E and F are the welfare losses. So one thing I wanted to call out in this particular diagram is that area D takes away a section of area C. You notice that there is this green rectangle that eats into what would have been consumer surplus if the monopoly was producing at the equilibrium level of output and selling at the equilibrium price. Why is this the case? Well, because the monopoly producer sets a higher price, which benefits the monopoly and makes the consumer worse off. Areas E and F represent the loss of consumer and producer surplus or benefits because of the monopoly's higher price and lower quantity produced. So all of these represent allocative inefficiency and welfare loss in society, signaling market failure. And this also shows how monopolies and firms with market power are types of market failure because they can charge a price greater than the marginal cost over an extended period of time. So before we close this video, I wanted to call out one unique type of monopoly called a natural monopoly. So a natural monopoly is basically a company that has economies of scale so large that it's possible for this one single monopoly to supply the entire market at a lower average cost than two or more firms. I've never really seen a natural monopoly question appear in exams, but it might be helpful for you to know the definition and how a natural monopoly distinguishes itself from a regular monopoly.